In 1689 Madrid, the royal family and courtiers observed a lavish festival celebrating the translation of a famous sculpture of Jesus Nazareno to a new chapel built to house it. The image, depicting Christ wearing a crown of thorns, hands bound, on his way to the crucifixion, was of particular significance in early modern Spanish devotions because it had been rescued after being seized by Moroccan Muslims as they conquered the city of Marmara in North Africa, which had been a Spanish presidio. Redeemed by Discalced Trinitarians in 1682 and brought to Madrid from Seville, its redemption and return to the capital city symbolized the triumph of Christianity over enemies both spiritual and terrestrial. This moment appears as a pivotal one in the spiritual life of a late 17th century Black holy woman, Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo. While I don't have time to elaborate the whole account, and I've discussed it elsewhere, the entanglement calls our attention to the multiple modalities of enslavement that coexisted in early modern Spain. I see the collision of the two as key to understanding the history of enslavement in early modern Spain and to the ways in which Spaniards thought about and understood the morality and legality of slavery itself, generating a framework for the ways in which Spaniards categorized, understood, and created visions of empire and humanity. And I think I'm not going to be talking about it so much today, but I think you can see at the nexus of a lot of these conversations is a great deal of anxiety, right? As it's along the lines of what Deborah was talking about earlier. So much important scholarship has been written about both the transatlantic slave trade and the Mediterranean slave trade. Yet the scholarship overall has a tendency to treat the two models separately. When discussed together, it is generally in a framework that sees the influence of Mediterranean models of slavery in the Atlantic world, right? The idea of a progression of modeling. Two important exceptions to this are the work of Arturo Morgado Garcia, who helpfully describes these symptoms as distinct models of enslavement, and his scholarship examines both in the context of early modern Cádiz and communities of enslaved people living there side by side. And Gillian Weiss, who analyzes Mediterranean and Atlantic slavery and the imaginations of 18th century France. She argues that thinking about, quote, diverse forms of servitude in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, quote, uncovers a shift in French ideas of freedom and unfreedom over time and provides a fresh outlook on the intersection between Mediterranean and Atlantic slaveries. This type of work is crucial for thinking with freedom and unfreedom, to use her phrasing. Spanish cities such as Seville and Barcelona maintain sizable populations of multi-ethnic and multi-religious enslaved people who shared parishes, streets, markets, and households as they worked alongside each other. Sometimes Spanish historiography suggests that these entanglements existed during a moment, the 15th century, for example, which then vanished later in the early modern period. Yet the evidence is clear that they did not exist that way, and such encounters merit greater analysis as we move forward through time from the 16th to the 17th and even the early 18th centuries. When thinking through the disparate systems of slaving in the early modern world, scholars occasionally distinguish slavery from captivity. And often we use these words interchangeably, but we usually only talk about captivity in the context of the Mediterranean. Slavery is, of course, the buying and selling of humans as property in a way that a race will greatly reduce their humanity. It is generally lifelong and intergenerational. Captivity is viewed as a model of unfreedom that is both reciprocal, meaning it can happen to you as well as to somebody else, and temporary. North African corsairs enslaved people, as we all know, from ships in coastal regions of Europe, engaging in similar practices with the Europeans, and they ransomed each other's captives, creating, as Daniel Hirschenazon and others has studied, an economy of ransoming in the early modern Mediterranean. A state of captivity with the promise of release and repatriation, which functioned very differently from the economies of the transatlantic slave trade. The potential for ransom and return is the starkest distinction between the two models and make them appear to be parallel systems without intersection. Yet we know the majority of Europeans and North African enslaved as part of Mediterranean warfare were not in fact ransomed, and still fewer escaped. Comparative rates of ransom, manumissions, and self-emancipation between enslaved North African/Ottoman people and enslaved Blacks within Spain have not been studied. though the most straightforward surface hypothesis would be that these patterns would be quite different among these two populations. To put it succinctly, the two groups of people were viewed by Spaniards through very different lenses, legally and morally. Such a gap returns us to Weiss and shifting ideas about freedom and unfreedom. I'm not searching for what to modernize might be understood as intellectual or moral coherence by Spanish thinkers, only that we reflect on the tensions, fuzziness, gaps, and distinctions in their thinking between the two groups for two reasons. One, to arrive at a deeper understanding of evolving Spanish ideas about the legal category of enslavement, which of course involved themselves as well. And two, investigate the entanglement of multi-ethnic enslaved communities within Spain in the 16th to the early 18th centuries, as Morgado has begun to do for Cádiz. My point of origin here is the discursive work of comparing Black people to Spanish sailors and holy objects, which offers windows into the complexities of Spanish thinking about the Atlantic Mediterranean and the ways they, Spanish, articulated racial and religious difference in this context. While Black Africans were frequently described, as we all know, as savage, ugly, deformed, incapable of reason, this view, of course, is a very complicated one. We see a lot of this language, particularly in the 16th and 17th century. North Africans and Ottomans were viewed as malevolent in particular ways, though they were largely white and maintained higher markers of what Europeans might describe as, during the period, might describe as civilization, including written language and cities, those kinds of things, which mattered a lot when Spaniards were engaged in hierarchies, civilizational hierarchies and demarcations of people, which were really important to their thinking in the 16th and 17th centuries. And yet white Spaniards found Black Africans allies against Islamic enemies, therefore offering, at least in theory, spiritual kinship. But this alliance in turn might have only been possible because the Spanish maintained the dominant position of enslaver and never enslaved in the Atlantic model. It was a gesture that could be offered as a form of magnanimity or largesse without any potential of being seen as weakness. In 1735, one Mercedarian in Seville, Pedro de Contreras, preached a sermon in honor of a Black former slave who died in the odor of sanctity, Magdalena de la Cruz. Magdalena had been enslaved in Cabo Verde, brought to Cádiz, and then to Seville at the age of 8 or 9. In his funeral sermon, Contreras employed the biblical allegory of Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, not to be confused with Deborah the prophet, who appears briefly in the cycle about Jacob and his family. Deborah, the faithful servant, is buried underneath a terebinth tree, although this is sometimes translated as oak, which was thereafter called the tree of weeping, which Contreras claimed emitted mercy. Deborah here stands for Magdalena, the faithful servant, buried under the protection of Our Lady of Mercy, the patroness of the Mercedarian order. And of course, Our Lady of Mercy's role in the patron saint of the Mercedarian order makes her their saints. Not of those enslaved and redeemed. This is a really important, if subtle, distinction. She is the patron saint of the Mercedarians' acts of redemption, not necessarily the patron saint of those in need of redemption, possibly. So even when she is depicted as holding chains, she stands in for the Mercedarians themselves. Or to put it more theologically correctly, her presence reminds the viewer of the Mercedarians performing Our Lady of Mercy's directives to free Spaniards enslaved by Turkish or North African corsairs. Later in the sermon, Contreras described Magdalena as particularly devoted to Our Lady of Mercy, particularly as redemptress of captives. Facing tribulations, Contreras continues, Magdalena experienced an apparition of Our Lady of Mercy, where the Virgin promises Magdalena protection if the Holy Woman puts herself under the Virgin's particular patronage. Magdalena thus converts into the Virgin's slave, exchanging the perils of terrestrial freedom for divine chains. So she was enslaved in the legal sense, right, as a child in Cabo Verde, and then she is free. She converts to Christianity. She becomes free. She lives this life of virtue, and then under this vow that she takes from the Virgin, she enslaves herself, right, spiritually. It's an interesting term because it emphasizes Magdalena's misery as enslaved during her time enslaved. Why else would she require particular mercy? While Magdalena's enslavers in her Spanish enslavers are depicted as loving and kind rather than oppressive. In the sleight of hand that connects Magdalena with the Mercedarian patron, Magdalena is transformed into a captive rather than a slave, redeemed by her enslavement because it brought her to Spain and to Christianity. The only enslavement that she actually suffers in this sleight of hand is the enslavement she voluntarily makes to the Virgin. The process of turning Magdalena into a captive redeemed through her slavery, as opposed to from her slavery, doubly objectifies her. Of course, as a slave, her personhood is put into doubt, if not outright denied. Outright denied, but her state of being is fraught and ambivalent. She is enslaved and free, free because she is enslaved to Christ and the Virgin rather than to pagan gods, and later to worldly concerns, unstated but including any desire for freedom from racism. Magdalena is both an object, her body, and a person, her soul. The pain endured by the body could act as a redemptive force, as we all know, an echo of Christ's suffering and the offering of redemption to all people. It worked in a dynamic bond with the soul, not in opposition to it. Similar dynamics hold true in medieval and early modern Catholic approaches to holy objects, particularly relics and sacred images. The relationship between the body and the divine is most evident in the case of relics, which were, of course, the bodies of the saints themselves, and which continued to channel divine gifts millennia after the saints themselves died. A bone was still a body, and a body acted as a conduit for the holy. The same could be true for the host or an image, whether painting or sculpture. Such objects were not bodies, of course, but their very materiality prevented them to act as conduits in the same way as relics. They were, in some sense, embodied. They performed miracles, they punished the unworthy, they expressed bodily fluid, such as blood or tears, and they experienced suffering when mistreated. When we think of the role the Mercedarians and Trinitarians played in the redemption of sacred objects alongside human beings, it is crucial to remember not only the spiritual priorities of the religious orders, but Catholic understandings of such objects as embodied and therefore requiring protection. More protection than humans in some ways being sacred and having more direct contact with the divine than a sinful person could. Throughout the early modern period, concern over the fate of sacred images in the hands of heretics and idolaters led to wide-scale efforts, particularly by Philip II in the 16th century, to acquire as many relics as possible from the Protestant lands to protect them from iconoclasts. Similar efforts were made to rescue sacred images that fell into the hands of North African corsairs, which also faced potential defacement and destruction. Mercedarian and Trinitarian attempts to rescue holy objects were cast as redemptions, in a similar vein to the redemption as individuals. The images were captives, subject to brutality and violence at the hands of God's enemies, and their safe return was of great importance to the order and to Spaniards more generally, and such rescues were sometimes celebrated with large festivals. Here we return to the one particular image redemption that I showed you a few minutes ago, the most important in the early modern period, the Jesus Nazareno. There are different accounts about the construction of the sculpture, but it was most likely crafted in Seville, commissioned by Capuchin friars. The life-size polychrome sculpture represents Christ in part of the Passion cycle, as you saw. From Seville, the Jesus Nazareno was taken to the Capuchin convent in the Spanish Presidio Marmar in North Africa, though political dynamics in Morocco changed soon after, and the Presidio was taken by the Sultan, people enslaved and the churches plundered for their valuable goods and images. One account of the fall of the city included a list of images taken by Moroccan forces, including the Jesus Nazareno, a Christ crucified, a Joseph holding his Christ child, Michael the Archangel, Lucy, Anthony of Padua, Francis of Assisi, and several images of the Virgin Mary. It further describes the mutilation of several of the images, one of which, quote, lacks the right hand due to insults and blows from the Moors, while one of the images of the Virgin Mary had lost her pedestal for the same reason. The Jesus Nazareno, like several of the other images, appears to have survived intact with its purple tunic, hands tied in front, and gold silk rope around its neck. Several other accounts of the events in Marmara also lamented the theft and mistreatment of images, quote, the sacrilegious actions committed against the holy images. Rafael de San Juan's short account of the redemptions achieved by the Trinitarians weaves together the people redeemed with images. For 1682, the friar mentions how Friar Miguel de Jesus Maria, Juan de la Visitación, and Martín de la Resurrección redeemed 17 sacred images. The sacrilegious actions taken by Moroccan soldiers against sculpture included dragging and whipping, in addition to cutting off limbs. Rafael de San Juan recounted, quote, having taken control of holy images, they began to insult and ridicule them, carrying them as spoils of their triumph into the city of Mequinez, planting them before the king, Muli Ismail. He ordered them dragged through the street out of hatred of the Christian religion, and afterward had them chased by lions as though they were human flesh, so that they would be torn to shreds. Descalzed Trinitarian Pedro de los Angeles was so distressed by this sight that he begged the king to accept the ransom to save him. This passage is particularly illuminating and speaks to the point above about the thinness of sacred images inhabiting a liminal space between divine and flesh. The images not only dragged and insulted, but the detail about them being torn apart by lions is particularly vivid because it echoes accounts of early Christian martyrdoms at the hands of Roman authorities, who often had such Christians torn apart by wild animals in the arena as the method of execution and for the entertainment of the audience. Here, the sculptures transform into early Christian martyrs, quote, as though they had human flesh. Key to notions of licit and illicit enslavement was the concept of theft, right? And we hear a lot about theft in the context of relics. Relics are stolen all the time in medieval and early modern Europe, and that's always an act of serious transgression. Theft was an illicit act, and everything that derived from it was tainted, both legally and theologically, the result of greed and sin. Captivity and enslavement acted as the ultimate categories of theft, whether human or object, transforming faith into horror. Redemption of people and objects asserted salvation. But to bring an individual into Christendom to be baptized and granted access to God's grace and salvation was a precious gift and not a theft. Actually, I think I have some more. No more abused images. Any suffering incurred along the way was part of the divine plan to redemption, and all early modern Catholics knew the more one suffered, the holier one was, as long as one suffered willingly. The brutal enslavement of men, women, and children, remember that Magdalena was a little girl when enslaved, in West and Central Africa was, by the time the sermon and hagiography were published, the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. From the very beginning, in fact, jurists and theologians had equivocated on the legality of the transatlantic slave trade, just as they had about the enslavement of indigenous people in the Americas. The framework of just war opened the door to the dislocation and enslavement of millions of people, most of whom were destined for the Caribbean and South America, although in the American and African context, enslavers were required to ensure their slave salvation through baptism, creating a religious justification for their enslavement in a context where just war ideas had less purchase than when enslaving Muslims. But theologians and jurists occasionally question the legality and morality of keeping baptized Africans enslaved, especially those born Christians of baptized parents. Referred to as, quote, perpetual slavery, this structure both lay at the cornerstone of slave society in the Americas and in contradiction to canon law. Anti-slavery arguments, beginning perhaps with Tomás de Mercado in the 16th century, centered on perpetual slavery rather than the institution of slavery qua slavery. More calls for the end of the brutality of the slave trade proliferated throughout the 18th century. Oops. You all heard, I'm out of time. I just need about 30 more seconds. Such calls were framed in terms of both canon and natural law and directly undermined the older justification of just war. In 1735 and 1749, when the works of Magdalena de la Cruz were printed, the transatlantic slave trade was at its zenith in the Americas, though increasingly marginal within Spain itself. The accounts of holy Black women provided the theological justifications for past and present Spanish slaving in West and Central Africa, impressing upon readers of the divine glories that could result from enslavement and conversion. By applying, even in a somewhat tortured fashion, the Mediterranean model of slavery, Spanish clergy collapsed Black bodies and sacred images as hostages to Christian enemies whose removed to Spain offered healing and release. Their lavish praise of Magdalena deployed Mediterranean captivity as a way of defending and explaining the West African slave trade within Spain. That framework would not work in Spanish America. At the same time, the integration of Black slaves into Spanish Christian society provided an opportunity to celebrate the taking of North African and Turkish slaves, not for redemption, but for lifelong forced labor. The contrast with Black saints reinforced the idea that North African and Turkish slaves, most of whom remained Muslim, continued to be enemies of Christendom and therefore deserving of enslavement. Thank you.